And as we are in week 1 of our Level Up series, our scripture lesson is taken from the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 8, verses 27 through 38. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." Well, this is week 1 of our Level Up series, where we're talking about the fact that as we're coming through the pandemic, we are wanting to come through better than we were. We're resuming in-person services here, and we don't want to go back to the church we were in March of 2020. We want to be better. We want to be more. So how is it that we can think about moving up rather than back to the way things used to be? Well, let me ask you a simple question, and you can admit it. How many of you ever bought something from an infomercial? All right, I know I actually did a couple of times, and I pretty much regretted it. You can raise your hands here. You can raise your hands at home and let us know if you've actually done that. Maybe you can put in the chat what you might have actually bought. But the thing about the infomercial is that the basic promise of the infomercial is that it would take a task and it would make it easy. But you know, the things I bought, rarely were they actually better. They hardly ever made things as easy as it looked in the infomercial. Well, wanting to be easy is a natural thing, and this is something that Jesus gets to, I think, in our lesson today. Jesus begins by asking his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And this is kind of an easy question because it's this third-person question. Who do people say that I am? And so the disciples are ready to answer, okay? John the Baptist, some are saying Elijah, others are saying one of the prophets. It's an easy question because it's really easy for you to talk about what other people are saying. But at the end of the day, that's also what kind of makes it meaningless, because it doesn't really matter what they say. And so Jesus moves on to the next question, and he directly asks them all, "But who do you say that I am?" This is the actual test. You've heard all these other opinions, but what about you? Peter is the only one who answers, and he says, "You are the Messiah." And this takes courage. It takes courage for Peter to speak up under that circumstance, and it takes courage for Peter to own his answer. And Jesus begins to tell him what that means. And so he says, the Son of Man must undergo great suffering. And this is something they don't understand. You see, Peter has just said correctly that Jesus is the Messiah, this person with incredible power. So Jesus has all the power, and yet he still must suffer. And so if this is the case, if this is what Jesus needs to do, if this is the life Jesus has to live, why is it that we spend so much of our lives looking for easy. See, I don't believe that God leads us in a direction by making things easy. And this is something that we fall prey to an awful lot in our everyday lives. I mean, sometimes we have a tough decision ahead of us. We're not sure which way to go. And suddenly, one of the paths opens up. Suddenly, there's an opportunity that just drops in our lap. And you know what often happens? Either we think or maybe somebody says to us, see, God is telling you to go down that road. Other people, perhaps less religious folks might use a more generic term like, the universe is telling you to go down that road or whatever it is. But you sit there and you say, wow, this just opened up. This looks so easy. This must be the way that I'm supposed to go. And yet, there's actually no spiritual precedent for that. There's no precedent in Scripture. The Bible basically never tells us that you can spot the way to go by looking for the easy route. And so when Peter is telling Jesus, you shouldn't take the hard path, you need to not talk about suffering, Peter rebukes him for talking about his need to suffer, and Jesus turns around and says, no. I'm going to rebuke you. Because you're setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Humans, you, me, we love easy. We want easy. But the divine things are the bigger picture. Jesus isn't being guided in his life by what's going to be easy. Jesus is being guided in his life by what is right, by what is good, by what is loving, by what his real purpose is. And that is how God leads us. God doesn't lead us by pointing us to the easy. God leads us by pointing us toward what is good and what is loving and what is righteous. In fact, Jesus so often is actually warning us against the easy. Think about teachings that you may have heard at other points in your church-going life, like where Jesus talks about how the road is wide that leads to destruction, but the right path is the narrow path. The wide, easy road, that's not the road Jesus is pointing us toward. Instead, Jesus is teaching us that we need to be following the good. We need to be led by love. And so often, that's not going to be the easy route. In fact, what he says is that if we want to follow Jesus, who is following the good and following the right and following what is love, then we're going to need to take up our own cross. We're going to need to take up a cross just as Jesus did. Because Jesus is not giving us a call to easy. But this, because it isn't easy, is a path we can easily fail on. Peter fails. Peter fails so many times, right? I mean, Peter, he's the one who gets out of the boat, walks on the water, and then next thing you know, he's drowning. He's the one who gave the great answer here, and then he turned around and didn't follow it through. He gave the great answer, you're the Messiah, and then he ends up trying to rebuke Jesus because Jesus tells him that being the Messiah means he's going to have to suffer. So Peter strives, Peter tries, Peter fails. Peter ends up denying Jesus 3 times. And yet that doesn't stop Peter from becoming great. It's a part of becoming great. There's a a business leader who has written some really interesting stuff. And I've quoted him before, it was years ago. His name is Ed Catmull, and you probably have never heard of him. Most of you have never heard of him. But he was a co-founder of Pixar and ended up directing Walt Disney Animation. All right? And so he was the head of this incredibly creative enterprise. I mean, Pixar Studios, hit after hit after hit, just breaking such new ground in the world of animated films. And you would look at him and say, failure, what are you talking about? And he says, we failed all the time. And he says this, he says, if you aren't experiencing failure, then you're making a far worse mistake. You are being driven by the desire to avoid it. See, in his creative career, they didn't try to avoid failure. They welcomed failure as a learning experience. Failure meant they were hitting the limits. Failure meant they were trying. Because how do you avoid failure? You avoid failure by not trying. See, if you look for easy, the next step is that you look for the guarantee. You look for the sure thing. And looking for the sure thing will always lead you away from what's hard. Because what makes it hard is that it's not a sure thing. What makes it hard is that you might fail. And Jesus warns us that that is not the path that we need to be on. He says, those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. And lose, that word that's translated as lose, isn't meaning death. It means ruin. You'll ruin your life if you try to preserve it, if you try to never fail, if you try to make sure that everything always goes well. You will ruin your life. If preservation is the goal, you will ruin your life. Instead, if you keep moving toward the good and keep moving toward what is right, keep moving toward what is loving, that's the path to be on, even if it's hard, and even if you don't know exactly where it's going to lead. Ed Catmull had a great statement about that, which I think is something that I try to remember. He said this, he said, the future is not a destination, it's a direction. See, you try to move toward God's values. It's a direction. When I think about our ministry here, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to move in the direction of being more effective messengers of the gospel, of being more effective at spreading God's love, at being more effective in showing love to our neighbors. It's a direction. It's not a destination. And when you get to that place in your life where you can see your future as a direction rather than a destination, then a central life question changes. See, the question stops being, what will I be if I achieve my goals? And we so often use that word what. After all, we do it with little kids, right? We tell a little kid, what do you want to be when you grow up? But the what doesn't really matter. The what isn't what ends up on your tombstone, right? The what isn't the goal. See, the real question is not the what, but the who. Who will I be if I achieve my goals? Who will I become when I move in the direction I try to move? Who frames your goals so much better than what? And it may be more ambiguous, and maybe that's why we don't think along those lines, because it is so much easier to think of our life goals in terms of a series of whats. I'm going to achieve this, and then I'm going to achieve this, and then I'm going to achieve this. But along the way, who will you become? I remember having a conversation with a person that was just it was a light conversation to begin, but he was reflecting on the things that he had achieved in his career. And one of the things he said he realized, and he used rougher language in describing it, language that I can't use here, but as he reflected on what his career led to, he said that being in the career he was in had, shall we say, hardened him. He had achieved so many whats in his career, but at the cost of the who. But the who is more essential, because you are not a what, you are a who. So who will you become if you move in the direction of your goals? And as you decide what that direction ought to be, make sure that you choose a direction not because it seems easy, but because it is worthy. Choose a direction for your life because it will make you who you ought to become. And choosing the right direction, not the easy direction, but the good direction, the loving direction, the righteous direction, the godly direction. Choosing the direction is the first step in leveling up. And we'll pick this up next week in week 2.